So let's talk about what I believe is a long-running scandal at the Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson's office that remains largely, basically undiscussed and ignored in the traditional media in Washington State. And this is the pay-to-play scheme where the Attorney General's office under Bob Ferguson's direction spends millions and millions of dollars on private outside counsel under what is typically called SAAG contracts, SAAG contracts. And coincidentally, those same firms who receive these contracts conveniently ensure that their partners and employees make campaign contributions to AG Bob Ferguson's political campaigns. I'm sure it's just incidental. Now, campaign contributions to Ferguson happen, and then, of course, Ferguson rewards them with these fat legal service contracts. How illegal is this? Who knows? And really, who cares? Because there's nobody to enforce the law when it comes to corruption scandals like this one. But let's discuss how the scheme works, and then you can decide if this is how state government should be run. Most people would probably consider it unethical, but how does this actually work in practice? Now, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons down below and then share this video with others. I think this will become part one in what is inevitably going to become some kind of a series here. And the more people who see this story and the more we can have an impact to expose the corruption, I believe, the better off we all are. So now let's get into how this campaign contribution kind of contract kickback scheme actually works and how it has operated at the AG's office under Bob Ferguson's leadership over the last 12 years. Now, first, just a bit of background on the Washington State Attorney General's office. According to their own website right here, they basically employ about 1,600 government workers in Washington State, which includes about 800 employees who are considered attorneys in 12 offices or all around Washington State. This essentially makes them the largest law firm in the state of Washington by quite a ways. However, apparently, this just isn't enough attorneys for all the litigation this office needs to perform. In recent years, under Bob Ferguson's direction, mostly this legal action is targeted at political enemies like thrift stores, pro-life groups, local anti-tax activists like Tim Eyman, and flashy litigation against Trump for press releases. Now, and of course, that only benefited him for a couple years during the presidency, Trump presidency. But there is just a fair amount of resources that are also directed at defending the various state agencies from their commonplace and regular abuse of the people. And of course, corruption, cover-up, litigation, destroying public records, which is a longtime habit of the Attorney General's office. And then a sizable portion of the office resources also has been dedicated to what we've already discussed on this channel a few times, these shakedown litigations that are targeting small businesses for cash payouts that can then be used to promote Bob Ferguson personally when he mails out checks to voters to help promote his campaign, like the recent chicken tuna check fiasco that we've discussed at various times on this channel. Now, along the way, the AG's office also frequently hires private practice lawyers and law firms to assist with litigation. Now, these are often referred to as SAAG contracts, which I mentioned earlier, SAAG. This actually stands for, and I'll quote from the AG's website here, Special Assistant Attorney General. And it actually refers to private lawyers who have been designated and appointed by the Attorney General's office to serve as counsel of record. And they can sign pleadings, they can sign advice memoranda, and they directly provide services listed in their respective contracts. SAGs may actually serve as division contract managers even. Now, this definition is basically from a sample definition that was provided in the Attorney General's website in their description section for their generic vendor contracts. They have a lot of them. And listen, it isn't a scandal necessarily that private attorneys from time to time are hired by the AG's office to do very specialized work that the attorneys on full-time staff at the AG's office may not be knowledgeable or skilled enough to do. This has been going on, truthfully, for just decades now, and it's hardly new. But what appears to have happened under Bob Ferguson's nearly 12 years in charge of this AG's office is that these very lucrative contracts have grown extensively over the past decade or so, and they seem to closely align, conveniently, with campaign contributions made from the very same beneficiaries of these contracts. Now, this is what makes this a pay-to-play scheme. And while nobody involved is likely to admit this, there is some evidence to support a much more detailed investigation by the public into what type of campaign finance kickback scheme the AG's office has been running at taxpayer, that's yours and my expense, for so many years now. Now, let's discuss some specific examples, and please understand there are hundreds of these examples. So let's just look at Bob Ferguson's personal law firm, for example. It's called Pacifica Law Group, and it's based out of Seattle, just like Bob Ferguson. And this is the firm Bob Ferguson used to threaten, for example, Secretary of State Steve Hobbs and try to force him to break the law and move Bob Ferguson's name to the top of the ballot this year. They did that just a few weeks ago. But that's the story that we've already discussed. This law firm has been the beneficiary of many SAAG contracts from the AG's office since 2013, which is the first year that Bob Ferguson was directly responsible for issuing these contracts. He was elected in 2012, but he started issuing them in 2013. I found at least 4 contracts, often lasting for years, within the first 7 years of Ferguson's tenure alone, just at Pacifica Law Group. Now, I don't have copies of all these SAAG contracts yet, but most of them are worth, at a minimum, of tens of thousands of dollars and often millions of dollars over the length of their contract term, and it just depends on the number of attorneys that are deputized and the length of time that they're paid by the taxpayers. That's you and me. Now, conveniently, and I'm sure it's purely circumstantial, according to the Public Disclosure Commission, partners and attorneys from this law firm, and this Pacifica Law Group, they donated at least $22,517.72 to Ferguson's political campaign. Now, this doesn't include additional funds that they might have recycled through political parties, PACs, or spouses during this exact same time frame. Now, listen, this is a good deal for law firms because they make relatively small contributions over time, limited by the campaign finance contribution limits, and then the number of partners or lawyers that make an adequate showing in their firm. Now, in addition, and this is in return, kind of this wink-wink, they get guaranteed contracts, just like these. I'm scrolling through just some right now. You can kind of see them. There's pages and pages and pages of these over the years. But they get guaranteed contracts that are paid for by taxpayers to do quiet, oftentimes just very quiet and unassuming legal work with really no concerns over collecting their billable hours because the state pays them pretty regularly and nobody's going to be looking over their shoulder. It isn't like anyone's auditing these contracts. From Bob Ferguson's perspective, and most importantly, his campaign fundraising perspective, this helps grease the skids for easy fundraising cash, and he uses other people's monies, that's yours and mine, taxpayers. He uses this money to provide the financial incentive to the law firms to keep the good times rolling and the checks flowing. I'm sure everyone involved will deny the obvious conflict of interest here and the fact that this pay-to-play scheme would be viewed very negatively in any private sector setting. But in Bob Ferguson's world, this is just how they roll. Now, I don't mean to just pick on Pacifica Law. There are plenty of other law firms involved in this process. You can see them here as they scroll by, and Pacifica really isn't even one of the big ones. For example, we can look at K&L Gates, which benefited over the past 12 years with multiple contracts from Bob Ferguson, and it only cost them about $48,945.50 in campaign contributions from their partners and employees just over the past 12 years to Bob Ferguson's political campaigns. Now, that's according to the Public Disclosure Commission, and again, this doesn't include cash recycled through the Democratic Party, their spouses of people who work there, family members, or other PACs. This is just a surface-level review. They're not alone. Foster Pepper, right here, now called Foster Garvey recently, which is just another big Seattle law firm that's also benefited from frequent SAAG contracts from Ferguson's office. Now, they only had to contribute about $16,568 to Ferguson's election campaign during this time. Perkins Coie, another Seattle law firm that became famous for its active involvement with the Russian collusion hoax and the Hillary Clinton kind of campaign concealment of their involvement in the Steele dossier at the time. Now, they only had to contribute about $26,584 to Ferguson, and they also benefited from a variety of SAAG contracts over the years. Now, sometimes it's a bit more difficult to follow the money because the employers of the contributors to Ferguson's political campaigns will, for example, abbreviate the names of their firms, and then you have to kind of cross-reference the SAAG contract under their full firm name. Like, for example, this one right here, Seattle law firm Fisco, Koreshnmer, Smith Dixon, Ormsmith. Anyway, which is usually reported to the Public Disclosure Commission by the abbreviation of FKSDO. Now, in this firm's campaign contribution history, they only gave $750 to the Ferguson campaigns. And this was only during the time of a few smaller SAAG contracts that they had with the AG's office at that time. It appears that once the contract was over, their campaign contributions dried up as well. In fact, for most of the attorneys and lawyers who contributed to the Ferguson campaign while they were getting or had the potential to receive SAAG contracts, those campaign contributions have actually dropped off now that Ferguson is running for governor. Not completely, of course, but they just don't seem to be in the same volume, which is actually pretty interesting. So here's my concern. Just over the past 12 years, and possibly longer at the Washington State's Attorney General's office, there's just no apparent policy in place that has been focused on avoiding obvious conflicts of interest between campaign contributions and then corresponding vendor contracts with this office. Now, I've only just skimmed through the SAAG contracts. It's just some of the most obvious and lucrative of these vendor contracts, and their close correlation, in many cases, with the campaign contributions to the very decision maker on who actually receives these contracts. So that would seem to justify a deeper dive into the financial records for sure. But nobody in state government or anywhere else in law enforcement is going to look. They just won't. Partly, they don't want to tread in the space where attorneys and litigious law firms lurk in the shadows, and then partly because most people rarely want to see how the political sausage is really made behind the scenes. This is just how business is run on the political side of Washington state. But it really should be a cause for concern on several levels, even if nobody in government or anywhere else is actually looking. Now, first, it's just a misuse of government resources to direct contracts like these right here, just so many of them, to vendors who then in turn make campaign contributions to your political election campaign. This conflict and the potential for corruption, it should just be obvious to everyone. Now, currently, when legislators or other elected officials run for public office, they're actually forced to disclose on their financial affairs documents with the Public Disclosure Commission all business customers and businesses they own which currently conduct business with the city or the state or whatever government entity over which they would be impactful in their elected capacity should they be elected. They don't all do this, of course, they're supposed to, but they're at least supposed to for transparency's sake. However, when an elected official like Bob Ferguson is kicking out millions of dollars in contracts to his campaign contributors, he's actually not required to disclose this fact at all. Now, that's a change that should be made in the public disclosure side of campaign finance laws. I'm not sure that you can legally ban these types of contributions, but full disclosure of these contributions and the obvious conflicts of interest that they really represent is worth the public widely knowing, and they should be made aware of this. Now, I believe it would be best if this information was also linked up on the official government website for the respective agency, in this case, the Attorney General's website, so that the public can see the truth without having to comb through public records, which the AG's office has a history of destroying, and then try to piece it all together after the fact, years later usually. There are numerous executive-level offices in our state which should have this type of reporting made clear. The Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, which conveniently also employs a superintendent's wife, for example, also hires many vendors and has many contracts with outside entities, and people who may be contributing to political campaigns of those who determine if those contracts can survive. Now, you would find the same potential conflicts at the insurance commissioner's office or the state treasurer, the office of the governor, and other positions if we're actually willing to look closer at how things really work. Now, finally, I really want to point out that I am only just barely scratching the surface here with both my research to date and the sheer scope of the problem today. Keep in mind, far more money is being diverted into the campaign coffers of politicians like Ferguson from people who have financially benefited from special deals like these than I believe has been revealed so far. But very few people even know how much this really is. A deeper dive into PAC contributions from these vendors and their spouses and family members is probably needed to better understand the full scope of the pay-to-play process that we're really just beginning to uncover right now. The public needs to be made more aware of these types of financial relationships and how taxpayer dollars are diverted to these special interests and vendors, which conveniently also influence campaign contributions and political power. Now, I'm not sure if you can prevent this, again, as I said before, from happening, but we can certainly demand more transparency so that the kickback schemes and the pay-to-play programs are just more obvious for all to see. However, in the end, of course, it starts with you and I. We have to do the research, and we have to work to expose the truth about these types of schemes and operations. Attorney General Bob Ferguson is merely a creature of corruption, and he's never going to change his ways as long as he can grasp for a position of political power. Now, those who expect to profit from his political position, they're going to fund his political aspirations. This is an old story, and there's really nothing new with this guy. As bad and as corrupt as he might be, from just a wonkish political perspective, I'm not even sure that you can prevent it and even totally prevent this type of kickback scheme. But I am sure that you can find ways to make the schemes more transparent and far more difficult to conceal. Now, we can't assume the traditional media is going to cover stories like this because they don't want to know the truth in most cases. And particularly cases like this, whatever's left of traditional media, they're mostly happy to support their political team, and they will not look for anything else to rock the boat. However, with a lot of capable researchers out there digging into this type of information, I believe that you and we can actually expose a lot of stories just like this one that otherwise will never see the light of day. The first step in fixing a problem is being able to actually expose it for all to see. Now, I hope this video will help inspire some of you to start turning over rocks where you live, or local governments who issue contracts to local vendors every day. Who else is paying to play? What does it cost them to influence a politician or ensure that they stay on the taxpayer-funded gravy train? You might be surprised at how little they need to donate to the political class to get these bigger payouts of taxpayer cash. So let's start looking closer, and we will see what to do. First, you must show up. File those records requests. Start researching the information and collect the data. Follow the money, and you will usually start to find the truth. But again, to make this impact, we must show up, because in the end, the future belongs to those who show up.